McIntosh. Dean Hollingsworth.
Present.
Modeste Dupel.
Present.
Sarah Good.
Present.
Caroline Hébert.
Présente.
Councillors Elaine McDonald.
Present.
Sid Gardner.
Here.
And Dennis Sabourin.
Present.
I get a motion to adopt the agenda as presented. Councillor McIntosh, Councillor Gardner, all in favor? Carried, thank you. So purpose of this meeting, this is a public meeting of council held under Section 12 of the Development Charges Act 1997 as amended. The purpose of the meeting is to give the public an opportunity to ask questions, provide comments, and make representations on the Development Charges Study Update, the proposed bylaw dated March 27, 2023. Council will not be taking any action at this meeting at this meeting on this report or the bylaw. Presentations.
So we have with us Mr. Sean Michaels, Stephen or Stevens? Stephen, with us from Watson and Associates Economists Ltd. And Sean Michaels will present the background study, Mr. Mayor.
Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So, as was mentioned, this meeting is
Sorry, 1 second, Councillor Gardner.
Sorry, before he starts, that camera is in a way of three of us here. Is that this meeting on camera now?
No, I don't think so.
I don't think it should be.
No.
It's for the meeting later
Well,
today.
it just, we'd like to be able to see the presentation.
Break it.
Tell me when.
I think top.
Just a little bit more.
There's an agenda package.
That's good. You okay?
Sure, yes.
Good.
No.
Thank you.
Call you, call and send him a bill.
no problem.
Yeah.
Interesting. A little bit of
So
All
there's
more
no-
reason
These
for
cameras
screening the
next month
corner.
at this time.
send him an email. You're welcome.
No, there's nothing.
Thank you.
We have a public meeting.
So the meeting today is a statutory requirement, as was mentioned, under the Development Charges Act, before a municipality can pass a new development charge bylaw. And before passing a new development charge bylaw, the background study and bylaw do need to be placed on the city's website at least 60 days prior to the passage of that bylaw. And so on the next slide, please, the purpose of the meeting today obviously is to receive another overview of the development charge proposal, to receive public input on the matter, and then in terms of a brief introduction overview of development charges, again in terms of their intent. They're a tool available to municipalities under the authority of the Development Charges Act. And the purpose of development charges are to recover the capital cost of new development, both residential and non-residential within a municipality. And when looking at these costs, these are the broader gross capital cost of new development within the municipality outside of those costs that would be constructed or paid for as part of a condition of development. And so with respect to the background study and bylaw being undertaken at this time, the city's current citywide development charge bylaw will expire on April 10th of this year. And so a new bylaw does need to be in place prior to that date for the city to continue to collect these charges from new development. Next slide, please. So in terms of the timeline that's been proceeded through, after going through with city staff and a fair amount of detail around the anticipated development in the city, as well as the growth-related needs to accommodate new development in the latter part of 2022, the study was presented to in draft form to City Council on January 23rd of this year, before it was placed on the city's website 60 days in advance of the anticipated bylaw passage date as required by the legislation. Then 2 weeks ago, there was a separate consultation meeting with development industry stakeholders that was held to again give them an overview of the background study and draft findings and receive their input, a summary of which has been provided to council, and some of those key, some of the key items of feedback are highlighted in the presentation today. Proceeding to the statutory public meeting today, after which the bylaw will come back to council for consideration for passage at your March 27th meeting, with an anticipated effective date of April 10th being the date that the current bylaw does expire. Next slide, please. And again. So just briefly on the methodology that is prescribed under the Act to be followed when passing or preparing a background study to inform a development charge bylaw. The process has commenced with understanding what the anticipated amount, type, and location of residential and non-residential development is within the city at the top of this illustration. Then the remainder of the methodology follows from that in terms of looking at what are the eligible development charge services. So there are certain services that are not eligible for inclusion in a bylaw, such as arts, museum, culture, administration space, for example. Looking at what the increase in need for services to accommodate new development for those eligible services, and in doing so, making sure that that increase in need for service is not greater than what was in place on average over the past 15-year period, so that development is not paying for a greater level of service than what has been in place historically. And then once understanding the capital cost to provide that increase in need for service for new development, there's then on the lower right-hand box a series of deductions that are required under the Act, the most significant being that to the extent any of the capital needs benefit existing development, those costs need to be deducted. And then the net growth-related capital costs are apportioned over that same development that this illustration commenced with to calculate a charge on a per residential dwelling unit basis or per square foot of non-residential gross floor area. Next slide, please. So briefly on that growth forecast that's been prepared from the 2023 to 2036 period, 2036 being the current horizon in the city's official plan. What is included there is growth of about just under 1% per year for residential growth, about 175 units per year. And on the non-residential side, growth of just over 1%, a slightly higher increase in non-residential employment growth, seen over that period about 3,590 additional jobs created, which would accommodate an additional approximately 4.7 million square feet of non-residential gross floor area development. Next slide, please. So the eligible services that have been considered for inclusion in this bylaw that are allowed under the Act include transit services, which have been assessed over the 10-year forecast period, being the maximum period that transit services are allowed to be considered in the Act. The remaining services have been assessed over that period to 2036, either on a citywide basis for services related to a highway, which include both roads and related infrastructure, as well as public works vehicles and equipment, fire protection, parks and recreation, library, ambulance, and waste diversion services, and then in the urban serviced area only, the citywide water and wastewater needs. Across all of those service areas, the total gross capital costs have been identified are just shy of $200 million over those 10 and 13-year forecast periods. As we can see on the lower right-hand side of the pie chart, just over half the costs have been deducted as a benefit to existing development, about $106 million, and not including the calculation of the charge. About $42 million have been deducted, or about 21% of the total cost, between other deductions and grants and other subsidies that are anticipated towards those capital needs, resulting in about 23% of the total cost, about $46.5 million, being included in the calculation of the charge. On the following slide, we can see how those costs break down by service area. And so across the hard services of roads, water, and wastewater, over 3/4 of the costs, the development charge eligible costs, are included in those three service areas, with almost 60% of the costs being related to services related to a highway. And then other service areas with significant portions of the total $46.5 million include parks and recreation at about $5.5 million and fire protection services at about $3.4 million, or 7% of the total growth-related cost. So based on that anticipated development and those net development charge eligible capital costs, The charge is then calculated per residential dwelling unit in the same structure as is currently used in the city's bylaw and per square foot of non-residential gross floor area. The charge decreasing by residential dwelling unit type based on the underlying assumed occupancy of those dwelling units based on census data. And so we can see the charge for the total charge for a single and semi-attached dwelling unit would be $13,931. That would decrease to as low as $6,354 for a special care dwelling unit, and for non-residential development, $3.90 per square foot of gross floor area. When we look at that fully calculated charge in comparison to the city's current charge, that would represent about an 83% increase for single and semi-attached dwelling units, an increase of about $6,325. And then varying increases based on the relative increase in comparison to the current charges by dwelling unit, where you can see from a percentage standpoint, the most significant change for one-bedroom and bachelor apartments, 142% increase, that greater increase being driven by changes in the underlying occupancy assumptions from census data between the census periods that underlie this calculation. And then on the bottom of the table, what you'll see then is the impact on the charge in year one, where it says a 20% reduction. And so we'll touch on this in a little bit more detail further in the presentation. But with some of the changes to the Development Charges Act that came into effect late last year with Bill 23, what is required is during the first year of a bylaw that only 80% of the maximum charge can be imposed. So actually, although the charge for a single and semi-attached dwelling unit, the fully calculated charge would increase by 83%, the charge that would actually be imposed during the first year of the bylaw would be a 46% increase based on the fully calculated charge, or a charge of $11,145. When we look at the non-residential charge, that charge is anticipated to actually decrease slightly based on the fully calculated charge, and so in the first year of the bylaw, there'd be about a 21% decrease in the non-residential charge. Next slide, please. So in this slide, then it presents the total development charges based on in the dark blue section of the stacked bars being the lower tier municipal development charges. The green section are education development charges, and the yellow section are upper tier development charges. And in the red, that is either lower or upper tier development charges or municipal act charges for water and wastewater capital costs, as some of the municipalities in the surrounding area utilize the authority of the municipal act to recover those costs. And so what we can see here is that the city's current charges, which are towards the lower end of the comparison, would move slightly up towards the mid-range, above that of South Glengarry and North Stormont, but still below that of North Dundas, Castleman, and the Nation. And that relative comparison would remain position, I should say, would remain unchanged with the fully calculated charge or the 20% reduction in the first year of the bylaw. And then to give some further context to those impacts for the development charges as a share of the price of the total sale price of a new single detached home, what we've looked at here is the average sales price from 2022 from impact data of newly constructed single detached homes. What we can see is that the price of homes in Cornwall are the lowest in the comparison to the same surrounding municipalities. And we look at the section at the top of the bars being in orange, being the share of that sale price that development charges would represent. We can see that based on the city's current development charges, their DCs represent about, or your DCs here represent about 1.4% of the total sale price of a home. When we look at that across the municipalities on average, that is about, in the other municipalities, that the development charges represent about 3% of the total sales price of a home. So in terms of the development charge policy here relative to other municipalities, it represents a much smaller share of the sales price, which is also less than in the other municipalities. And even at the fully calculated charge, the development charges would still only represent 2.6% of the total sales price of a new single detached home, still lower than the average of the surrounding municipalities. Next slide, please. And so on this slide and the next, it illustrates the position of the non-residential charges in comparison to the same municipalities. What you'll see is that with the charge decreasing by about 21% in the first year of the bylaw, 1% overall, obviously the competitive position of the city either remains the same or improves slightly for commercial development on this slide, and on the following slide for industrial development. We see the same relative position being maintained, but with a decrease in the overall charge for the city. So then, having understood the calculation of the charge, the competitiveness of that charge, then in terms of the bylaw policies that manage the implementation of that bylaw and the administration of the bylaw, a number of these policies are dictated by the legislation. Others are at council's discretion to some extent. And so development charges, for the most part, will continue to be calculated and collected at the time of building permit issuance. Exception to that would be for rental housing and institutional development. Those charges will be calculated and collected over 6 equal annual payments commencing from the date of occupancy. For any developments that proceed through site plan or zoning bylaw amendment approvals under the Planning Act, those charges will be calculated on the day those applications are made and then held frozen at that rate so that the charge is calculated and set earlier in the development approvals process. And then for either those installment payments or those charges calculated at planning application, the city would impose interest, and the Act now stipulates a maximum interest rate, which is the average prime rate plus 1%. So for development charges not be payable, the exemptions do need to be either defined in the bylaw if they're at council's discretion, or they're defined through the Act, and those are the statutory exemptions, which are also included in the bylaw for consistency. And so the exemptions that are identified in the Act that municipalities must witness include development charges not being paid for or payable for upper or lower tier governments and school boards, development of lands intended for use by a university that receives operating funds are exempt. Any existing industrial buildings, they can expand their existing floor space by up to 50% without the payment of development charges. And then some tweaks to prior exemptions for additional residential units were made through Bill 23, and those include now that for any existing or new residential buildings, you may add up to 2 additional apartments within an existing or new single-detached, semi-detached, or row house, and one of those additional units can be in an ancillary structure. And then for any existing rental residential buildings, either the greater of 1 or 1% of the existing units in that building can also be added, and there would be no development charges payable. So nonprofit housing is now exempt, a change with Bill 23. Previously, the mandatory installment payments applied to nonprofit housing. Inclusionary zoning affordable housing units are also now exempt. And then with Bill 23, the Development Charges Act now also identifies that affordable rental or ownership units as well as attainable units will be exempt. However, that exemption is not yet in effect, and it will be once it is proclaimed by the Lieutenant Governor. Next slide, please. Then other statutory reductions to the charges of that for rental housing. There are reductions available or applicable to the charges. So if it's greater than 2 bedrooms, a 25% discount to the charges payable. A 2-bedroom unit would have a 20% discount, and less than 2 bedrooms would have a 15% discount. And as I touched on earlier, there is now a mandatory reduction to the maximum charge that must be witnessed in the first 4 years of the bylaw. And so during the first year of the bylaw, only 80% of the charge can be in place, 85% in the second year, 90% in the third, 95% in the fourth year of the bylaw, and then the full charge can be enforced for the 5th through to the 10th year of the bylaw, with development charge bylaws now having a maximum life of 10 years. And so in the table at the bottom of the chart, we can see that with the maximum charges and the statutory phase into those charges, the rate could increase by 46% in year 1, followed by about 6% increases thereafter between years 1 to 4, a further 5% increase in year 5, and then that rate being held constant for the remainder of the bylaw. However, indexing would apply inflationary increases to the charges on an annual basis. So in the non-statutory exemptions, so these are the exemptions at council discretion but do need to be defined in the bylaw, include bona fide farm uses, places of worship, hospitals, and then any infill development within a priority area of the heart of the city, CIP area, would also be exempt. And one of the last couple of policies here to highlight would be redevelopment credits. So they continue to be available generally in the same fashion as they are currently defined in the city's bylaw. And so if there is a conversion or demolition replacement of an existing use, development charges would not be payable on the new development for the share of that new development that relates to what is being replaced. So if you're replacing a single-family home with a new single-family home, there would be a credit that would offset any development charges payable. Next slide, please. Then, as I mentioned, in terms of indexing of the charge, so the charges would be indexed annually on a mandatory basis, that indexing to occur on the anniversary date of the bylaw, being the same date that the phase-in, the change in the rate as a result of the legislative phase-in would also occur, so the charges would just change at one time each year for administrative ease. And so then lastly, so the last thing I wanted to highlight was in terms of the stakeholder feedback that was received, detailed notes in terms of the questions and comments that were provided or were received, and the responses provided have been given to council. The main theme around those questions and the comments received were around a desire for, if the charge is to be increased, for it to be increased on a more gradual basis than the legislative phase-in would provide for, and also for council to consider whether the affordable housing exemptions would be put into effect by the city prior to the province enacting them through legislation. And so what I wanted to highlight here on the table on the bottom portion of the slide is on the left-hand side, that's the legislative phase-in that we saw earlier with the 46% increase, followed by about a 6% increase thereafter. Whereas if the charge was increased more gradually, we would see about a 13% increase annually over that same period to get from the current charge to the full charge in year 5 of $13,931. The thing I think to make sure council is aware of is that with any exemptions or phasing into the charge, there is an impact on revenues from development charges in terms of revenue foregone as a result of those phase-ins. That any of those impacts do become a funding requirement of the city, and so any revenue foregone as a result of exemptions or further phase-ins is an impact to the city's tax base or through rates that would need to be funded. And so based on the anticipated pace of growth with the legislated phase-in, there'd be about $1.8 million in terms of revenue foregone, or about $0.9 million per year over that period. When we look at the phase-in, the more gradual phase-in, be about a $3.6 million shortfall over that 4-year period, or about a or about, sorry, it'd be about a $450,000 shortfall in the first scenario. In the second scenario, about a $900,000 shortfall annually, about a $3.6 million total revenue shortfall over the 4-year period if the charges were phased in more gradually.
Thank you for your presentation. Before I have questions from council, could I get a motion to receive the report, please? Councillor Hollingsworth, seconder. Councillor Sabri, discussion. Councillor Hollingsworth.
Okay, just so I'm crystal clear, on that very last page, if we implemented the slower phase-in as per requested by the, I'm assuming, contractors or the public in general, is that right, that we would, over that 4-year period, would be short $3.6 million? Did I get that number right?
That's correct, based on the pace of development anticipated in the background steady growth forecast. If development was slower, then that number might not be as high, but if development picked up at a higher pace, that number might be greater.
Okay, so based on, I guess, a projection on where, kind of the graph or whatever. So that being said, and maybe this is to Ms. Bailey, if we're looking at $3.6 million after 4 years, that's an operating sort of side of the ledger, correct? Like that's bottom line, somebody has to come up with $3.6 million, right?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I believe it's the capital side that we're not collecting the dollars.
Yeah.
As far as.
My point is, if we're financing, it's one number on the bottom line. If it's on the operating, that's a giant chunk of change there.
So development charges are used for capital, and so we wouldn't have the necessary monies to support all of those capital projects,
So, in essence, then, if we had to borrow 3.6 million, as just an example, we'd either pull it out of reserve, or we're gonna borrow the money, which works out to about, if we amortize, and I realize the numbers can change depending on what we're doing, but if we amortize that $3.6 million, that's about $360,000 a year if we took a 10-year period approximately. Is that making sense?
approximately.
So half a percentage point per year tagged on to every budget for the next 10 years.
Probably a little less than that, but in general, yes. And I'm
No
not sure
problem.
if Mr. Steven wants to explain,
Yeah, I don't-
expand on that a little
Feel
bit
free
more.
to jump in, but is that making sense?
Yes, I don't have more accurate numbers at the moment, but your logic is
The
correct.
premise is
Yes.
there. Okay, thank you.
Further questions from council? Oh, Councillor Good?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor. I'm just wondering how this would apply to either, let's say, sorry, I'm losing my words here, tiny homes or trailers. Like, would developmental charges apply to anything like that or not?
Yes, they would. If they are a dwelling unit that requires a building permit, they would apply.
Okay, and so if you had like a lot that had, let's say, 10 or 12 tiny homes, would they each count as a single unit, or in this case, would it count as a multi-unit?
So each, if they were detached units, then they would each count as a separate single detached dwelling.
Even on the
unit.
same lot?
Yes.
Okay, interesting. Okay. All right, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Further questions from council? Okay, seeing none, then all in favor to receive the report? Carried, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, if I may, before we go to the comments from the public, there is a second part to that recommendation, and that is that council, pending any updates approved this evening at our regular council meeting, consider the development charges bylaw at its meeting of March 27th.
And you'd like a motion for that, Madam Clerk?
Please, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, I got a motion, Councillor McIntosh, seconder, Councillor Sabri. Any debate on the date? Okay, seeing none, all in favor? Carried, thank you. So So now we'll move on to the portion where we have comments from the public. At this time, the public will have the opportunity to ask questions, provide comments, and make representations on the development charges study update. There is a report on the agenda for the regular council meeting of February 27, 2023, that is this evening, to discuss any changes to the draft development charges bylaw. Council will be considering the bylaw at its March 27th meeting, a month from today. Are there any comments from the public? Mind taking the microphone, Brad? Oh, yeah. And introducing yourself as well, please.
Hey everyone, how's it going? I'm Brad Robertson from Menard Robertson. Obviously, Mr. Stevens, super intelligent guy, very intelligent firm, and I think the study's super fantastic. And we obviously see the need, for the funding. Our biggest concern is, we build residential homes, and we're seeing at this point the competition with the market is tough, right? Our costs have not stopped going up. We see the lumber and building materials in the news, oh yeah, it's going down. Labor is a big portion of housing, it has not gone down. Metals keep skyrocketing. There's still a lot of factors that are not allowing us to be competitive with what's on MLS, right? So if we want to keep building, we have to be competitive with what's on MLS. If not, we're gonna have a hard time selling homes, right? I think Mr. Marco would agree with me. I think when we do our own calculations, there's a home that was recently sold on Burke Avenue, and it was sold for $570,000. For us to build that house today, we're looking at just shy of $650,000. Okay, that's what we would have to charge our client. The development fees, it's not going to help us attain our competitive edge with the MLS. And of course, it's a market, and it's driven by supply and demand, and it may go back up. We're in February. We understand all that. I would just be in favor of the gradual phase-in, because a 46% increase this year, I think, would be detrimental to me employing my staff, to me selling homes, to us building in the city of Cornwall. And when I look at the majority of where we're building in South Glengarry and South Stormont, there is easily a $15,000 variation between their permitting fees and our fees when you consider, if a client goes on well and septic versus using a municipal water system. So I think, in reflecting that, I think obviously we need the funds, and I would appreciate the consideration for a gradual increase.
Council asking questions? Sorry, one moment. Any questions for Mr. Robinson from council? Councilor Good, and then Councilor Hollingsworth.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. I certainly appreciate that a 40%, 46% increase. It feels like a lot, especially when you're looking at like 76. I'm wondering, because the 3.6 million is what's ringing in my ears.
Yep.
And the way that we have to recover that is from the taxpayer, like yourself. I'm sure you're a homeowner, I believe, as well in town. And that obviously impacts our entire community. The difference that I'm seeing in the first year, if we do the phased-in approach, is a difference of $2,500 and change. Actually, $2,559 is the exact number. On a new home, when you're selling a new home, do you see a $2,500 increase in your cost being a barrier to selling that home?
So it's not the 2,500, it's a 2,500 once, and then the 4 other people behind who is also giving us the $2,500 increase, right? So you're right, it's the 2,500 seems very small, but we're getting it from every end, from metals, from lumber. We just got a newsletter from BMR today with lumber prices on the rise again. It seems like everywhere we turn, we're getting $2,500. You do that 10 times, we're at $20,000. So you're right, $2,500 is not a barrier to buying a home, but it's coming from everywhere, and that's where we're struggling. We're doing stuff in-house to try to, okay, how do we cut costs without cutting our quality? We have very amazing builders in Cornwall. We're super blessed with great builders. we don't want to go to the route of having to turn over poor quality homes to try to be competitive. And that's where I'm worried about it's the 2,500, 2,500, 2,500. We're at 20 grand.
Certainly, and I definitely appreciate that. Of course, you know, when a business is charging
Yep.
a difference in their prices, they can make it up by increasing what they're selling their product for. For us as a municipality, that comes directly from the taxpayer, and so that $2,500, it's whose back is it going to come off of? Is it going to be a business or is it going to be an individual? A lot of people are struggling right now, and unfortunately, we're in budget right now,
Yeah.
so it feels
Yeah, it's
very
timing,
immediate.
for sure.
When I hear 3.6 million, it like, you know, and I understand that's over the course of 5 years, but no less. I just, I wanted to know if that impact, and certainly the costs of goods and the cost of labor have gone up. Yeah. So you would like to see this phased in?
Yeah, and obviously, we have to do what's best for the community, and I understand that 3.6 is that's a scary number.
Significant.
Mr. Stevens, don't say numbers like that when I'm trying to prove a point. No, but, you know, obviously, you guys have to do what's best for the community. Just on our end, we just wanted to say, we appreciate Mr. Stevens. That wasn't presented to us last time, so they did the work and brought this, so I appreciate that. But definitely, you know, it'd be in favor, we'd be in favor of seeing a gradual, you know, approach to this phase.
Thank you for
Thanks.
coming in.
Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I think I know the answer, but I'm just gonna make sure you're telling me you're selling your houses in the city for $20,000 more than you're selling them out in the counties, correct?
If they are on well and septic.
But the point I guess I'm trying to get to is that $20,000 isn't all city fees, correct?
That's just permit fees and development fees.
We're $20,000 more expensive.
Not if you're building in, like, let's pretend Arrowhead, who are on municipal water and sewer. That, no, they have their own fees. But if I'm going to build in Maxwell, we're building a house in Maxwell right now, and they're on well and septic, their permit, I'm gonna say, is $3,500 in the city of Cornwall. Of course, it's probably $20,000 at this point, but it's they get the city services. So
Okay, so just so I'm clear, though, we're not really comparing apples to apples.
no, we're definitely not comparing apples to apples.
Well, I just want to make
Yeah.
sure, because the media's going to print what they're printing, and that's fine, that's their job, but let's make sure we know that.
Yep.
So,
No, for sure.
well and septic is not the same animal
No,
as
and that's why I said well and septic, right? That's
And you're getting
yeah.
a different set of features depending.
I'm just trying to be as impactful as Mr. Stevens.
Well, fair enough, I get it, you gotta do what you gotta do,
Yeah.
but let's make sure that
Yeah, no,
we're
for
crystal
sure.
clear on
For sure.
what we're,
Yep.
you're talking about, I'm getting apples out in the counties on selling what, and I'm getting oranges and, which, whatever, but let's.
It's just the competition level. That's
My
it.
point is, when we're assessing whether we
Yep.
phase in or not,
Yep.
we gotta make sure we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, and all we're doing, I think, is just comparing. You know, like if somebody had a budget of $900,000, there's 20,000. Do they want to pay $20,000 for city services? Maybe. That was my point, right?
Yeah, I know.
It's to the client's discretion.
We're not even offering well and septic, just an FYI. Don't, you know, you're in the city, you hook up, that's how the game works, just so that we're clear on that too. Anyway, thank you for your time, thank you, Your Worship.
I think it depends where you're hooking into, Councillor Hollingsworth.
Well, yeah, out on the edges maybe, but not
Yeah.
downtown.
Power dam. Any further comments for Mr. Robinson from council? Thank you, Mr. Robinson, for your
Perfect.
comments.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
them. Any further comments from the public? Okay, I'll ask one final time. Any further comments from the public?
Amherst Corners.
Okay, thank you.
Appreciate the costs are going up. Costs for putting That's right.
With nothing else on the agenda, I'll be looking for a motion to adjourn this meeting, please. Councillor Gardner, Councillor Hebert, all in favor? Thank you. Council, we have council later tonight. We'll see you then.
Okay, so. Fingers.